Hello, and welcome to today's member-only webinar, Introduction to the Supplier Certification Toolkit. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also will be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Any unanswered questions will be answered afterward via email. Now on to Hannah Deans, Senior Standards Manager for Textile Exchange. Hannah?
Thank you, Rose, and thank you for attending this webinar. This is the second of a two-part series of webinars that introduces the updated certification toolkit. Today's webinar focuses on the Supply Chain Certification Toolkit. There is also a brand and retailer version, and we've held a webinar for that, which is available to access in the Hub. In today's webinar, we're going to provide a high-level overview of what the toolkit covers. We're also going to take a look at how the certification system works, the chain of custody system in all Textile Exchange standards, and the certification process. We're also going to have time for a Q&A at the end of the session. So I'll start by introducing the team who will be presenting. I'm Hannah Deans, and with me I have Trini Gantner, Standards Manager, Val Colden, Assurance Manager, and Stephanie Pokorski, Senior Standards Coordinator. And we also have Callie Weldon, who's a Standards Coordinator with us as well, who will be moderating the Q&A. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to introduce the broader integrity team that you may come across as you work with one or more of our standards. We're a growing team, and as you can see from this image, a very global team. But before we get into looking at the toolkit itself, we'll take a quick look at the portfolio of Textile Exchange Standards, which, like our team, is also growing. The latest edition being the Responsible Mohair Standard, which sits alongside the Responsible Wool Standard and addresses animal welfare, land management, and social welfare at the farm level. Not included on this chart, but we are also working on developing a draft Responsible Alpaca Standard. And as you can see on this image, whilst the standards have different focus areas, they have the chain of custody element in common, and that is going to be the focus of this webinar. The toolkit itself is a resource for companies that are interested in becoming certified to a Textile Exchange Standard. It provides an in-depth look at what certification is, how it works, what the process, costs, and benefits involved are. The toolkit is available to download on the Textile Exchange website. I'll now hand over to Stephanie, who will provide an overview of the content.
Thank you, Hannah. So we'll take a look at what's inside the actual toolkit document itself. Here you can see just a high level of the contents. So we've got a general introduction and several different sections about certification, of course. And at the end of the document, we also have very brief introductions to the Textile Exchange Standards and some appendices with additional useful information. So I will change my screen over to the toolkit document itself to give you a little bit of a tour inside. So this document is 32 pages. Here's the content page again. And as you can see, there are hyperlinks for the navigation throughout the document. So here we have those high level sections that we just looked at on the PowerPoint slide, and beneath them show just a sample of some of the topics that appear under those sections pages. So not all of the topics are listed here. These are just most of the most commonly used ones or the most important ones. So there's a lot more content under some of these sections, which once you click the link to it, you can find out more. So I'll just scroll through some of the pages. And also within the document, you'll find more links to other parts of the document itself, as well as external documents for external relevant documents, as well as external web pages for more information. see that takes you right to the How Does Certification Work section. We've got updated diagrams to help you understand a little more of the content more clearly. Under the chain of custody section, we've got some scope certificate and transaction certificate checklists, which are useful for understanding what should be included on those. There are links to the appendix, which include examples of filled out transaction certificates and scope certificates, which are always nice to see. So here's the section at the end about the standards. You can see just this very high level introductions and some of the key points and objectives of the standards. These also include direct links to the standards documents themselves, as well as the user manuals for each of them. In the appendix, we have a glossary with helpful definitions for some of the terms that might be new to you or confusing to you. And finally, the scope certificate example and the transaction certificate example appear at the very end with additional links to download the full PDF so you can view it a little bit closer. So I'll just go back to our PowerPoint here and I will pass it on to Trini, who will talk about certification as well as our certification process.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hi, everybody. So the information I'll be presenting you'll find in the toolkit on pages 5 to 7, as well as 8 to 10. So first, let's look at why certification is actually necessary and the benefit that it provides. And there are 3 main ones that I want to mention. The first one is brand protection. Second one is purchase assurance. And the third one is that certification can provide greater credibility to the claims that are being made. Generally speaking, certification ensures that environmental and/or social improvements lead to real and meaningful change. So let's look at the types of verification that are out there. And they vary on the scale of investment versus integrity. Textile Exchange Standards use third-party certification, which have a little bit of a higher investment, but also offer the highest integrity. So let's look at them more detailed. So the first party verification is a self-reporting system. The second party verification is where a company audits against their own supply chain. And the third party certification, which is the one that we use, is conducted by an authorized third party certification body. Now let's look at how certification actually works. Next slide, please. So how we set our standards is that we follow a very rigid and rigorous standards development process. We are a member of the ISEAL Alliance, and ISEAL stands for International Social and Environmental Accreditation and Labeling. And they have 3 main codes, one on standard setting, one on assurance, and one on impact, that we closely follow alongside our own procedures on standard setting and assurance. So the goal of our standards is to provide clear and realistic scope of impact and metrics. We use a multi-stakeholder process to develop all our standards, and we provide a strong assurance system behind our standards. The multi-stakeholder participation is an aspect that I want to hone in on because we do not design our standards in a vacuum. Our stakeholders play a strong role via the International Working Group, which comprises different entities in the industry, brands, retailers, farms. Everybody basically in the supply chain is open to participating and helping us create a stronger standard on the back end. Now let's look a little bit at the roles of the different organizations included. So we have the standard scheme in the middle, which is the white bubble that you see here, and Textile Exchange, which is the bubble on the left, blue bubble on the left, is the scheme owner. So we own the standard, we design and develop the standard, and we maintain the standard. However, we work with certification bodies who will audit for conformity with our standards, which is the entity here on the triangle bottom right. And then there's also the accreditation body, which provides oversight over the CBs to ensure that every standard is audited for consistently, which is the accreditation body, the bubble at the top. And then at the bottom of our pyramid, we have the certified companies which are implementing our standard, which is you guys listening today. Here's an overview over the CBs that we're working with. And this is a comprehensive list that you can also revisit by visiting our website, linked at the bottom here. And that's it. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Val, who will tell you more about chain of custody.
Hello. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the chain of custody system as it applies to companies in the supply chain. So when we're talking about chain of custody, we're talking about the traceability of products through the supply chain so that we can identify them and maintain identification of properties from the source through to the final retailer and end user of the product. The image you see here on the left is everybody's dream, where it's easy to track where everything comes from. It's very straightforward all the way from the source to the retailer. Though, of course, the image on the right is more like what we're all working with. And in fact, maybe even a simplification of many supply chains. So when we're looking at this, we need to have a better solution in place. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about chain of custody, we work with a few particular principles. We work with product identification, so ensuring that certified products are accurately identified, and also that the content percentages of claimed materials are accurate. So if you're working with any of our animal content standards, the responsible down standard, the responsible wool standard, or the responsible mohair standard, all material of the applicable type that's included in a certified product needs to be certified. It's not allowed, for instance, to use non-RDS down within an RDS product. If we're looking at our other standards, at the organic content standard, the recycled claim standard, or the global recycled standard, mixing is allowed, but calculation of content percentages is required. The next area we talk about is product segregation, which is where we ensure that certified and non-certified products are not mixed together, that they're stored separately, that they're identifiable, or that they're separated via, for instance, a facility only having certified products. The final principle I'm going to talk about is volume reconciliation. And this is a process of ensuring that the certified outgoing products match the incoming inputs, so that the input plus or minus the production loss numbers is equal to the amount of output. Next slide, please. So with Textile Exchange, we talk about the content claim standard. This is our chain of custody standard that applies for all claims relating to Textile Exchange standards, and that is used for the supply chains for all of these standards. The content claim standard is our chain of custody standard that gets used. With each standard, you have different input requirements at either the first processor or at the farm level, depending on which standard we're talking about, that you can see at the bottom of this image. With the GRS, there's also social, environmental, and chemical requirements at every processing stage through the supply chain. For our other standards, it's simply based on the CCS and on having that chain of custody that leads at the end to a claim that can be made about the standard and about the product. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about two very key documents that come up, and these terms come up quite a bit when you're hearing about certification to any Textile Exchange standard, and sometimes to other standards outside of Textile Exchange as well. The first is a scope certificate. A scope certificate is a document that confirms certification for a particular company or a particular site with a particular scope. And so the scope will define which locations are included, which products are included, who allowable subcontractors are, and so forth. This is issued by a certification body. So one of the certification bodies that Trini pointed out on a previous slide. who has come in and verified that this company is qualified to produce goods to a given standard. So obtaining a scope certificate involves being audited before receiving the first scope certificate, and then generally on an annual basis thereafter. Next slide, please. The second document that comes up within our systems is our transaction certificates. Transaction certificates are issued to verify a particular sale. So from one company or one site to another company or site, covering a specific shipment of products. So a TC is intended to verify the exact products and materials that are being claimed. And within our system, a transaction certificate is issued each time any products are changing ownership. Next slide, please. So the flow of documents, you can see a diagram here that every step through the supply chain, from the very beginning up to towards the end of the supply chain, will have a scope certificate in place. So for instance, for a wool supply chain, you might get a farm that is certified, followed by a trader or a wool broker, followed by a scour operation, a yarn spinner, and so forth. Each step in the supply chain, the facility that is handling the materials needs to have their own scope certificate in place. This also applies to anybody who takes legal ownership of the materials, even on a trading basis where they don't necessarily take physical possession of the product. Again, for each sale of the product through the supply chain, a transaction certificate is issued to move from one step to the next through the supply chain. Next slide, please. So applications for transaction certificates. In order to receive a transaction certificate, the supplier of the product needs to first be certified to the applicable standard, and then is required to submit a request to their certification body for each shipment or each group of shipments. So if there's a number of shipments happening over a short time for the same standard to the same buyer, this can be combined into one transaction certificate. The requirement is that you submit information about the details of the shipment that is listed off here. So including documentation, including quantities, and including links back to the incoming transaction certificate. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the certification process. So the first question is, who needs to be certified? And we do hear this question in various forms quite a bit. We require certification for all sites through to the seller in the final business-to-business transaction. So the seller in the final business-to-business transaction may be the brand, in the case of brands who sell their products on to retailers. It may be the final manufacturer in the case of brands who exclusively retail their own products, whether it's through their own stores or through e-commerce setups. Regardless, the direct supplier to the brand does need certification, so such as the garment factory. It is never sufficient for the garment factory to just have a fabric supplier, for instance, who is certified to the standard. That factory needs to be certified themselves as well. Okay, next slide, please. So some essential steps for supply companies. First, understand what your customers' requirements are. Which standard are they looking for? What are they looking for in terms of their sourcing? If we're talking about OCS, RCS, or GRS, what percentage content are they looking for? The next is to choose the standards to be certified against. Typically, this will be a specific request from your customers, but in some cases, there may be need to review the particulars of what is needed. Choose a certification body to work with. So we have a total of 21 certification bodies who are able to offer some degree of certification services. Not all of these certification bodies can work with all of our standards in every country or geographic region of the world. But there are options for just about any standard and country combination. So we do encourage you to speak to multiple certification bodies and get multiple quotes to determine which option will be best for you. Submit an application to the certification body. There will be preparation work you need to do, and then the certification body will schedule the audit with you. Typically, an audit involves a certification body auditor visiting you on site in person and reviewing what goes on at your facilities, both in terms of documentation and in terms of physical handling of materials. Following the audit, you may receive some nonconformities or NCs. Some certification bodies use different terms for these, but the principle is the same. These are areas where your systems do not quite meet the standard yet. These generally shouldn't be seen as failing the audit so much as having something that needs to be fixed. You need to fix these within 60 days following the audit in order for the certification body to issue your scope certificate. Once you are certified, share your scope certificate with any customers who have requested your certification. And then when you're prepared to sell a certified product, request a transaction certificate for those products if they contain a claimed material. Next step, next slide. So timeline for certification. So all of these steps that I've talked through, they do take time. The amount of time this takes is highly variable. A best case scenario, we give an estimate of about 6 to 8 weeks. This does depend on a number of factors. This depends on the certification body's availability in your region. So sometimes there can be delays if they're seeing a high level of demand, or if an auditor needs to travel a long distance and they're hoping to bundle multiple trips together to save on costs. This depends on any delays that come from your side. So one of the most frequent causes for delay in an initial certification process is delays on your end with payment, with preparations, with addressing nonconformities, all of which can add time to the process. Additionally, I will mention that in this time of COVID-19 related shutdowns, we are seeing there is likely an extension to this time. Textile Exchange has put in some flexibility for certification bodies. And I know in some cases, initial audits can occur on site, though most auditors cannot cross national borders right now, which does limit some options. There are some cases where you may need to wait for shutdowns to be lifted in order to have an initial audit be done on site. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to pass things over to Stephanie to talk about some frequently asked questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Val. So that concludes our introduction to most of the content or some of the content that appears in the Supplier Certification Toolkit. And while we didn't cover everything that's in there, we do hope it was helpful for you. And we also know that there are still a lot of frequently asked questions around the area of certification. So we've put together a handy FAQ cheat sheet for you to reference when you're looking through the Certification Toolkit document yourself. Here we've listed off some of the main questions that are asked. And of course, number one is always how much does certification cost? And there is a whole section on the cost of certification in the toolkit, which we didn't cover in this webinar, but you can find that on page 20. We go through more details on what a scope certificate is and what is a transaction certificate. On pages 13 and 14, how to apply, do I need to be certified, what is the process, and then more information about the standards starting on page 25. And in addition to these quick FAQs that you see on this presentation slideshow, we do have a page on our website. If you go to textileexchange.org/integrity/standards FAQs, you will find a whole list of frequently asked questions and answers there. So now I'll just give a few updates from our team. We're currently in the process of a few revisions and developments of different documents and programs. So the first is the Content Claim Standard, or CCS revision, is now taking place. We have opportunities for you to join the International Working Group. We're always welcoming as many participants as possible to give input. So if you would like to join, you can always visit our website at textileexchange.org/content claim standard to learn more about the revision, the timeline, the meeting schedule, and the general process involved there. You can also contact standards at textileexchange.org to learn more, to request to be added to the mailing list for that IWG. And at the same time, as Hannah mentioned earlier in the presentation, the Responsible Alpaca Standard is currently in development. So the same as the CCS, you can visit our webpage for the RAS to learn more about the timeline and the opportunities for joining that international working group. And you may contact Responsible Wool at textileexchange.org to learn more or to request joining as well. And finally, we have our claims policy revision, which is actually consolidating all of the current logo use and claims guides that we have for each standard. At the moment, all standards have their own version of this document, though there are a lot of similarities across all of them, and we're bringing them all together in one policy document for ease of reference and use. So currently this document is out for public stakeholder consultation. This is the draft of the document itself. So we are very keen to have stakeholder input, and we have the link there to give feedback on that draft document. It's a jot form. We can send this link out in the follow-up as well, or you can contact standards at textileexchange.org to learn more or to give your input. And one thing that's not on here that I'll mention briefly is that we are also in the process of revising our web pages for the standard. So currently we just have the one page, which is textileexchange.org/integrity, that contains all of the information associated with our standards and the certification process, information about certification bodies. And we are super excited to be releasing several web pages under the standards umbrella that will help guide you through the process of certification and understanding more information about our standards and our accreditation system, frequently asked questions, an area to download documents and such. So we're really looking forward to that update, which should be happening at the start of August. So with that, we can go into the Q&A portion of our webinar, and Callie will be moderating this Q&A. So Callie,
hi everybody, it's actually going to be me, Trini.
Okay.
So the first question that we have is, do these documents exist in other languages, such as French? This could be a useful tool for the suppliers we have in Morocco and Tunisia.
I can try to answer that question. I'm assuming that the question is for the Supplier Certification Toolkit document. So currently we don't have any translations available, but we may look into that in the future, depending on how many requests we might get. We do have some of our standards documents translated, particularly the RDS is user manual for the RDS is translated into a number of different languages, including Mandarin, Chinese, Polish, Hungarian. Oh, now I'm on the spot, I can't remember the other ones. A lot of Eastern European languages overall. The Responsible Wool Standard is translated into Spanish, and I'm not sure if I'm missing anything, but if any of the rest of the team can remember current translations, then they can shout it out. But yeah, these toolkits are not currently translated, at least not yet.
Thank you, Stephanie. The next question we have received is, if a brand wants to claim the product is certified by GRS and labeled, does it mean all relative suppliers should have scope certificates? For example, ideally garment factory, trader, fabrics mill, yarn mill, and TCs should be there between each bodies. Val, do you want to take that one? Or Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, I can give a brief answer if Val wants to give more detail. However, the answer is yes. Any part of the supply chain prior to labeling needs to be certified, and being certified entails having a scope certificate. So, and those parts of the supply chain, those suppliers will not be able to pass on a TC to the next step unless they have a scope certificate. So Val, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Oh, that sounds great.
There's a follow-up question to that one. Some scope certificates are valid for 1 year. How early should factories apply for extensions before expiration?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So typically your certification body will reach out to you for that. Typically we recommend that the audit be done at least 2 months before the expiry of the scope certificate. And so enough time in advance of that for your certification body to schedule. And it is useful to ask them about this when you're earlier in the certification process so that you can be prepared.
Thank you, Val. And at this moment, I don't see any other new questions. I'd encourage you to type them into the chat box so we can tend to your question. And that said, we're always happy to answer your questions also over email under standards@textileexchange.org. So if you hop off the webinar and say, I wish I would have asked, there is still an opportunity. I'm going to give it a little bit more time, but it seems like we have addressed most of the open questions coming in. All right, sounds like that is it. So I will hand it back to Hannah, I believe.
Oh, thank you, Trini. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to all the presenters. And I will close this webinar.
Thank you to our speakers again, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. As a friendly reminder, we will be sending out an email to all registered participants to be able to view this presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.